Absolutely, and especially now, So
Yeah.
you have the floor, and you feel free to share your screen and everything.
Okay, so
it's all good to go.
So great, thank you everyone. So very quickly, as I say, we're going to share some thoughts on the psychology of fixated persons. A very quick bio for those of you who don't know me or know nothing about Diffuse. So in 2016, in the UK was beginning to kind of get involved in the debate around Brexit. A young female politician was tracked down by an extreme right-wing fixated individual and assassinated in the street. Now, when that happened, I was the person that was then brought in by the UK Parliament to stop that happening again. And 12 months later, my team and I, in fact, did stop the next attack with solutions that I've introduced. 2019, we then launched Diffuse Global, which really brought the very best practices in terms of the processes we've been protecting politicians with out into the commercial world. We particularly specialize in the online world, social media, and the dark web, etc. So let's make a start. So why do you need to know about fixated people? Well, the reason is it's such an important subject, and one, in my opinion, that, as I say, anyone who's involved in your industry, protection industry, and is a professional needs to understand it, because fixated people potentially pose the greatest threat, not just to those that you're protecting, but to you as well. That said, what we know is that, as the slide illustrates, physical protection measures alone, be they human or technical, will not stop a fixated person who is committed to harming their target. There are loads of examples of this throughout history. Many world leaders have been assassinated despite the fact of a full protection team, not by professional assassins, but by fixated individuals. And, you know, one of the great examples, I guess, is Ronald Reagan, who I'll sort of talk about a bit later. And those of you who are familiar with that will, of course, be aware that Hinckley evaded all those security measures. He shot and injured Reagan and injured 3 others, one of whom subsequently died from his injuries. And the people who are fixated and those that pursue famous people, celebrities, etc., they pose a greater risk of death and serious injury than terrorists or criminals. So this is the key area that people need to understand. So let's be clear what we're talking about. Over the last few days, I've been pretty much fixated on getting this presentation done. And one of my really good friends here in the UK is pretty much fixated on the football or soccer, depending where you're from, the transfer window. Every 5 minutes, he's checking his phone to see whether his team have bought any new players. That is not what we're talking about. That is not fixation. What we're talking about is what's often termed pathological fixation. And the person who's pathologically fixated is effectively unable to think of anything else. Every waking moment, they are consumed by this fixation. It is a mental illness and can be seen in the level of interest that they have on their subject. They'll have cuttings out. They'll be turning up at lots of different events. Social media posts is obviously a huge thing. Letters. But their obsession is such that it's the only thing they can focus on. And one of the challenges of this is that when you're a fixated individual, they have a greater desire to get close to their subject of interest. And any attempt that tries to stop them doing that increases their anger and therefore increases the threat. And this is why, and a point I'll touch on a bit later, if you are having a fixated individual and you get an injunction or a restraining order served, you know, that actually raises the threat level, not reduces it. But I'll touch on that a bit later. So when we talk about the impact of fixated individuals, you know, mismanaging or getting this wrong can absolutely range from, violence and death, as I say, not just to your target, but to those of you who are responsible for protecting them, and the kind of collateral damage of passers-by. We touched on the Reagan assassination attempted assassination a few moments ago. He hit Reagan because one of his rounds bounced off a vehicle. He hit a protection officer, and he also hit a journalist. So his accuracy, if you like, of fire was so poor that collateral damage was huge. So to undermine or underestimate these people is massive. The psychological stress of those who are on the receiving end of a fixated individual can't be underestimated. Now, if you are targeted by somebody and you are subjected to a fixated campaign, there is lots and lots of research around how it makes you feel anxiety. A very recent example, for those of you who are familiar with Harry Styles, the UK musician, pop star, was he had a stalker. And he talked very openly. In fact, he tweeted about it, how he had a protection team looking after him one night, and yet he was in his house checking the doors and checking the locks. So despite the fact he had protection, he still didn't feel safe, and it was still causing him huge anxiety. It will probably cause you anxiety as well, and that's not to be underestimated, because there's somebody out there who is probably not going to act in a rational way. But again, as I say, mismanaging it and not understanding it or taking seriously can cause disruption at events you go to, can embarrass the protectee, but it will also embarrass you as a professional. You'll get adverse media attention, because if you mismanage it, if you're overzealous with that person that doesn't need to be physically restrained, for instance, that will reflect badly on you as an organization and badly on your principal. So the reputational side of things is key. Reputation is also a massive thing for your principal, because of course, if you mismanage it, all the mental health organizations will be very critical of the principal. And very often, one of the other issues we see regularly is the wasted resources. I had a conversation with a client a few weeks ago where they had a stalker, and they were asking me what to do. And when I asked them what they'd already done, what they were talking about was increasing their resources. That is often a complete waste of time. We've already discussed how physical measures aren't necessarily a good thing in terms of stopping those that are fixated. And actually, unless you understand the fixation and the different type of it, you will waste resources. So let's talk about some of the kind of detail around how these individuals operate and work. So the top three images relate to fixations on individuals. There are two types of fixations in general terms: individuals and causes. So let's talk about the top three, because two of them are assassinations, but the third slide is also related. So the top left one relates to Mark Chapman, who killed John Lennon in 1980. Now, what people don't perhaps know is that he actually stalked him for several days. He stalked him, he talked to him, had a conversation with him, and then subsequently killed him. He was a massive Beatles fan. And what happened was he became really angry with John Lennon's lifestyle. And Lennon made a remark that they were more popular, that is, the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. Now, he made that remark in 1966 and was murdered for it in 1980. Chapman was angry that Lennon had kind of preached love and peace, and yet he had millions, and he considered him to be hypocritical. He planned that murder for nearly 3 months, and went to New York on 3 separate occasions, conducted recon, all sorts of things. One of the key aspects of those that target an individual is they seek notoriety. And what happens is that they are forever then associated with the person they attacked, whether it's fatal or not. So if you Google John Lennon, Mark Chapman will always be associated with him. In the next slide, we're looking at Reagan. If you Google Reagan, Hinckley is also always related to him. And that's one of their fixations, is that they will be linked with that person forever. That's what motivates them. Now, you'll notice the slide obviously includes the image of Jodie Foster. And there's a reason for that. And that is because John Hinckley, he had a fixation on Jodie Foster, and he attacked Reagan outside a conference to impress Jodie Foster, who he had been stalking for ages. In fact, he actually wrote to her saying, "Over the past 7 months, I've left you dozens of poems, letters, and love messages in the faint hope that you could develop an interest in me. Although we've talked on the phone a couple of times, I've never had the nerve to simply approach and introduce myself. The reason I am going ahead with this attempt now is because I cannot wait any longer to impress you." Now, there's no connection between Jodie Foster and Reagan, and yet he, in his fixation, in his mental illness, considered that if he assassinated Reagan, Jodie Foster would have no option to notice him. He later actually said the shooting was the greatest love offering in the history of the world. Personally, I disagree, but there we go. So there's a very specific reason why they target individuals as opposed to causes. Very often, though, causes are more dangerous. So that the images on the bottom relate to causes, and the bottom left, for those of you who are not familiar, is in fact Joe Cox, the politician who was murdered and who I referred to earlier. And the individual that killed Joe was a extreme right-wing fixated individual. He had been a white supremacist for decades. He was well known to the Southern Poverty Organization. He was well known to the apartheid regime. And Brexit was a lot about the debate around immigration. And he had that fixation. Now, the interesting bit about British politicians, for instance, and this kind of feeds into why causes is such an interesting subject, is that when you attack a person in furtherance of a cause, the individual is just a byproduct. They're actually seeking publicity for their cause. The reason in the UK, for instance, that every British politician that's been attacked or murdered has been attacked by a local constituent. So in the UK system, we are split up into constituencies, and each politician represents that constituency. And every time they've been attacked, it's by a local constituent. The reason is because it's not them, it's the cause they're trying to drive forward. They are just a figurehead for that cause. Which brings us on to the next three images. And of course, you know, we'll all, certainly the first two will be very familiar with you. The more recent one with the Congress situation, and then of course Black Lives Matter. And in many ways, those two are the opposite ends of an argument. And then the last one, of course, is the anti-vaxxers, which certainly in the UK is a big thing, and across Europe we're seeing riots and demonstrations in some places around that. And I predict that potentially these three causes are going to be even bigger this year. So if you are actually representing or looking after someone who in any way is engaged in some of these causes or is anti these causes and actually talking about them, you need to understand that they will be a target for these people, because some of these people within these causes are going to be dangerous people. They're going to be mentally ill, they're going to be fixated, and they're going to want to make a name for themselves. And so, you know, you need to understand that you may not see them as being particularly dangerous around this, but they are just a figurehead and they will be targeted. So one of the most obvious signs of fixation is stalking. Now, certainly in the UK, stalking is undefined in the law. We have an offence which makes it an offence to stalk someone, but actually it's not defined in terms of what is stalking. And as far as I'm aware, across the globe, there is no real kind of universal definition. But for the purposes of what we're talking about and what I've always worked to, you know, it is really what we say there. It's the predatory pursuit and harassment of one person towards the other. Now, the key elements are the repeated attempts to make inappropriate contact, and also the issue around trying to, you know, cause fear. One of the common issues around stalking is it causes the individual to change their behavior. Now, a lot of definitions talk about the individual being in fear, but actually the definition goes further in many cases and talks about either the person who is the target or those who protect them believe they're being stalked. So we've dealt with a number of clients, as an example, who were totally unaware, for instance, that they were being stalked, but the protection team were aware. So we were working with the protection team, but the principal was unaware. And that's quite usual in terms of you as the protectee will know there's an issue, and you can decide this person is a stalker, we need to manage this. Now, it's also relevant, and we've touched on it all through today, really, when I've been listening in, that nearly all stalking now is going to be cyber enabled, and you know, with the Internet of Things, it can be very intrusive, and that can have a real impact on, at times, particularly in the beginning, the principal or the target of the stalking can think they're going mad because things are happening. We've taken calls more recently where, you know, where all of a sudden something's going on in the house, the lights are coming on, or what have you, as we get involved in smarter houses. So if you are working with someone and they start reporting sort of strange things going on, it's absolutely worth thinking about, you know, a TSEM survey and making sure that actually there isn't something going on. They're not monitoring you. I've got, for instance, security cameras. Someone could hack into those and look at us. So if your clients have got the same, you need to be thinking about that. Stalking isn't necessarily just somebody turning up. It's done on the internet now. Now, even though most stalkers don't actually carry out their threats, all threats should be taken seriously because they're distressing and they cause fear and they cause this sort of unknown. People look into a crowd when they're going to have a press conference or they're going to an event, and they're just looking out there knowing that someone's targeting them, but they don't know who, and that causes fear. So the key thing about stalkers, and the reason that we need to understand it in greater depth, is because there are different types of stalkers. There isn't one stalker, and they pose different threats and different risks to different people. So I'll very briefly go through this. Clearly, it's a kind of slightly in-depth subject, which if you do come across this, my advice is always, you know, seek out the professional help of those of us that are trained in it and can identify it. But if we go through them, you know, the rejected stalker is normally your sort of domestic stalker. Actually one of the most dangerous. So these people are normally people that start stalking after a breakdown of an important relationship, which usually, but not always, has been kind of intimate, a sexual relationship. Now, what they look for is reconciliation or revenge, or a bit of both. Lots of domestic murders result from these type of stalkers. And one of the other issues that we've experienced over the years with rejected stalkers is, if a rejected stalker identifies that the person that's rejected them now has a new partner, they may target that individual. And of course, that may be your client as well. So, you know, again, a very dangerous type of individual. The next one, an intimacy type of stalker. Now, there's someone who desires a relationship, often with a stranger. So they target strangers, professional contacts, acquaintances, very, very common among celebrity stalkers. So so for instance, as an example, they will fixate that a celebrity who plays a certain role, they may fall in love with that character and think that the individual is actually really that character. And if only you knew me, you'd fall in love with me. That's how their minds kind of work. And what they're looking for is, you know, that kind of reciprocation of love. And if it doesn't happen, then of course that raises the stakes. Yet again, another group that, let's say, a celebrity, and when they find, or the news reports that the celebrity has a new partner, they will target the partner, because in their mind, if they can get rid of that partner, there's an opportunity for them again. Again, can be very, very dangerous. The incompetent suitor, and Hinckley, by the way, was an intimacy seeker. The incompetent suitor, again, you know, as it says, usually lonely individuals. They're usually socially and interpersonally inept, and they have a sort of feeling of entitlement, but indifference. They tend to move. So it's a move their attention. So if they're not getting what they want, or they're getting rebutted from their particular attention, they often move on to somebody else. So that, you know, they might just suddenly start following someone at a random state. And we've got the resentful stalker. Now, I think we're going to see a lot more of this, and certainly we are seeing more of this in the commercial world that we work in. They set out to frighten and intimidate, and basically take revenge for what they perceive to be a humiliation or an injury, and they get this sort of sense of power and control. They make overt and covert threats. Now, whilst they rarely resort to physical violence, they do. And so we've seen workplace massacres, for instance. We've seen school shootings. They're often these kind of resentful stalker. Now, we've seen this more recently with hostile ex-employees. And I think certainly from the UK perspective, we're seeing that more in terms of COVID, but we're seeing it internationally. So we have had a client recently based in the US, who is being targeted by a UK national. And for that reason, because he feels he's been humiliated, he's been sacked, he's lost his job because of COVID. I think we're going to see more of this. And whilst I make the view that they're not always violent, they like to frighten, intimidate. It can't be ruled out, because that is what they're doing, with loads of experience and examples of that. And lastly, we have the predatory stalker. These are your rapists. These guys will do a lot of hostile reconnaissance. They'll gather information. They'll rehearse and fantasize about what they'll do. They get gratification from voyeurism. Often they're covert, but they can go overt, because they then enjoy the fact that the victim knows they're being watched but can't control it. This is a small percentage of them. Often, as I say, serial rapists, and they tend to get more dangerous the more they do it. So, what do we do about it? How do we find out about these people? Well, like many people who are targeting certainly public figures, and most of what we do is looking at public figures and those in the limelight, celebrities and family officers, etc. They leave clues, and if you look at a lot of the cases in history, there's been clues, there's been information. Jodie Foster's one. He was writing to her, and he told her something was going to happen. Now, we didn't know what it was going to be, but if they'd have watched him as a result of that, they'd have clearly identified it. So one of the key elements I want to get across to you here is, you as a security professional will not know anything about any of these unless you start engaging with the teams and the staff who work for your protective people. So that might be the housekeeper. It might be their personal assistant who reads their emails. It might be the security guard that sits on the gate. It might be your cordon team, who might be just a part-time team that come to events and what have you. And the reason we say that is because they're the ones that will probably see and be on the receipt of this. And certainly, when we're looking at the linguistic red flags, they're the ones that are going to get emails or potentially text messages if they're monitoring their phones or WhatsApp messages. They're the ones that are going to read the letters. And unless they understand that these aren't just ramblings of a mad person, they may actually be clues. They may actually be indications that someone is dangerous. They will just dismiss it and not tell you. So it's important that you or you get someone who's professional in these terms to actually brief those people, so that that they know what they're looking for. And then you have briefings and debriefings. Because let's take approaches to persons or officers. You get events where on the outer cordon of the event, for instance, an individual turns up. But interestingly, he turns up at every event. But different people are on, he turns up and speaks to different people on security detail. So unless you're debriefing, you're not aware that same person's turning up. Now, a good example of that would be the guy that assassinated Robert Kennedy. Because what he actually did was, in the 5 months leading up to the attack, he made about 4 different approaches. Now, we don't know whether they were failed attempts or whether they were hostile reconnaissance. But effectively, he made 4 attempts or 5 attempts. He then breached the security and hid in a pantry at the hotel where Kennedy was turning up, and then got out and shot him to death. Yes, that's an extreme example, but this may happen because fixated people, that they are fixated. They're going to continue doing it. It's what drives them. So have briefings and debriefings. Leakage is when someone, like the scenario around Jodie Foster, they will leak what they're going to do. They will tell somebody something's going to happen. Today's the day. I'm going off to do this today. They'll pack up their stuff. They'll leave evidence that something's changing. Pseudo commando is, if you think of Breivik and you look at him and look at what he was doing, he was often posing pictures of himself in uniforms, what have you. They often do that. It's almost to kind of create this kind of identification as if they belong to something. Energy burst is when all of a sudden, as they approach the attack time, their activity starts speeding up. They might start closing bank accounts. They might clear all their stuff and put it into storage, but it'll happen quite quickly. And clearly, the closer they get to the attack, the quicker that's happening. Novel aggression is a great one. We look often, if we have the opportunity to look at people's previous convictions or their behavior, and we dismiss convictions that we don't, or actions that we don't think are relevant. So you might see that 4 months ago, the guy you're looking at went and robbed a post office or robbed a shop, and you think, so what? What's that got to do with what we're doing? Well, what it's doing is this, is he is testing himself to see whether he can, I'm using he because they're generally he, whether he can actually use violence unprovoked. So novel aggression is where they do that. They do some random act to see, can I actually do this? Now, clearly, if they're a career criminal, if you like, they probably won't do that. But that is a really common one. Lone protest, you'll get the same protester on his own at all various events. He's fixated on that cause, so therefore he's going to keep turning up. Or you might get random legal cases, which are just nonsense. But again, you know, they need to be recognised and looked at. The linguistic red flags is what I was talking about in emails and telephones, etc. You'll get people talking about suicide or last resort thinking. Those are absolutely critical. So last resort thinking will be something like, you leave me no other option, or I've tried everything, or you've backed me into a corner now. And suicidal obviously is suggesting that they're prepared to commit suicide. And the reason those are so dangerous is because what they're actually saying is, you know, they're not bothered about dying. They're not bothered about what's going to happen to them now. They see that there's no other option. And then, of course, you've got homicidal. If people start talking about homicides and what you're murdering people, then we know that there's, you know, clearly that's an indication that they may pose a threat. So, you know, all these things, you know, we can go into so much more detail around them, but I'm conscious of the time. They need to be understood. So as part of, you know, very few sort of protection details that I've worked with have had much training in this. And so we provide this sort of training for them. One of the favorite ones I have is Hunters and Howlers. And this is based on Hughes research. And what it basically says, and it again relates generally to public figures and that, what it generally says is that those that make threats don't pose threats. So if you take the analogy of a wolf, you get those that howl, those that make noise, they pose threats, they're the ones that are abusive on social media, those are the ones that will shout and abuse and all those. And then you get the other one, you get the hunters. And the hunters are quiet. They don't make threats. They don't do any of that stuff. And the research is fascinating. When you looked at one of my business partners, Robert Fine, who's worked for the US Secret Service, did the research where they looked at every attack on a US senior politician over a 50-year period. And not one of them was attacked by someone who'd threatened them previously. They read that research in Europe. And again, I've done it in the UK, and it fits every time. And in fact, in nearly 4,000 inappropriate communications towards judges and other kind of judicial people, they found that less than 9% of them followed up any of their threats. Now, I'm not saying you dismiss someone that makes a threat. You can't do that, clearly. But what you also can't do is ignore the quiet one that doesn't necessarily make a direct threat. And that's why the communication bit's interesting, because in my experience, very often, if they are communicating, they're doing it in context rather than direct threats. It might be something like, I know where your children go to school, or I saw you out in Gucci shop today. It'll be something that's context that tells you they're watching you. They will not say, I'm going to kill you today. And if you think of the logic of it, they're not going to say that because they don't want you to stop them. So this hunter and howler concept is where resources get wasted, where people focus and put all their attention on those that are making threats and, you know, making the noise and all that on social media. Now, we do follow the people on social media that do all that because they cause a psychological threat to your client, and therefore, and potentially nowadays a reputational threat, certainly. But in terms of a protective threat, they are unlikely to be the ones that do that. So just bear that in mind if you're looking at the social media, or if you're working for a celebrity who's getting abused. Now, some of you who might have seen my some of my social media in the week, I talked about Spielberg's recent case. So just to put it in context, he's been having a stalker for some time, and she is somebody who apparently was sending him film scripts and what have you, and he was ignoring them. Yeah, I'm sure he gets thousands of those. So we're talking about a resentful stalker here. And what happened was that a message came in initially saying, if I have to personally murder people for stealing my IP, my intellectual property, I will. Now, Spielberg was then informed by the police that she attempted to buy a gun with the intention of killing him. So here's the thing. They took a restraining order out. That restraining order tells her she can't come within 100 yards of him for 3 years. Now, if I think someone's going to have a gun, I'd want them to be a lot further away than 100 yards. That's the first thing. She's banned from harassing, intimidating, or threatening him. Well, in most places, that's illegal anyway. She's not allowed to contact or tag him on social media posts. Okay, well, on anonymous things, interesting how you're going to prove that's her every time. My point is this, though, is that when you take out a restraining order, as we talked about earlier on, and when you put an intervention in, shall we say, that's where they often get angry. And if we go back to one of the things I mentioned earlier around the fixated people's desire to get close and how they get angry when they're not allowed to do that, when they're stopped from doing that, that is why the risk goes up. There has been several cases in the UK where, certainly in domestic scenarios, an injunction's been served, and within 24 hours, they've killed the person they were stalking. So if you are working with a client who is being stalked as a fixated person, and you are involved in that conversation around the restraining order or some other intervention taking place, you need to make sure that you're aware of what's happening with the law firm that are doing that. The victim needs to know that's happening. But also what you then need to think about is, at that point, do you increase the security? So you need to become more vigilant then, not less vigilant. You can't rest on the fact there's a restraining order or some other thing, because actually that could be the catalyst that makes things more dangerous. So that kind of concludes really the presentation from me. I hope it was of interest to you and that you learnt one or two bits and pieces there. All I would really emphasize is that fixated people are, a very real threat. They're a very real threat that you may come across on a daily basis. So please, do take them seriously. And if you need any more information, then certainly, by all means, come and ask me, and we will happily share information.